The ballroom in the heart of New York City was breathtaking. The kind of place where everything seemed to sparkle under the golden light of the crystal chandeliers. It was one of the most exclusive charity galas of the year, organized to raise money for children's hospitals. The guests were a mix of high society, business tycoons, and a few Hollywood stars. Everywhere you looked, there were expensive tuxedos, glittering diamond necklaces, and waiters moving through the crowd with silver trays carrying champagne that cost more than a week's salary for most people. The air in the room smelled of rich food, expensive cologne, and money. Despite the luxury, the atmosphere felt a bit stiff. People were laughing, but it often felt like they were laughing because they were supposed to, not because anything was actually funny. It was a room full of people trying very hard to be seen by the right people. The soft sound of a jazz piano played in the background, barely audible over the hum of conversations about stock markets, real estate, and upcoming movie deals. In the middle of this expensive crowd stood Keanu Reeves. Unlike many of the guests there, he wasn't trying to draw attention to himself. In fact, he was doing the opposite. He was dressed in a simple, well-tailored black suit, but he didn't wear any flashy jewelry. His tie was straight, and his hair was neatly combed. But he had a relaxed energy that made him seem out of place in such a formal, stiff room. He stood near the edge of the main crowd, holding a glass of sparkling water. He wasn't drinking the expensive champagne. He was just there to support the cause. He was quietly listening to a few organizers talk about the hospital wing they were trying to build. People recognized him, of course. He's one of the most famous actors in the world. But there was a strange rule in that room, unspoken but powerful. Most of the wealthy guests pretended not to see him. They would glance his way, do a double take, and then quickly look away, giving him space. It was a sign of respect. Keanu had a reputation for being kind, humble, and private. And even the richest people in the room seemed to understand that he wasn't there to pose for photos or sign autographs. He was there to help. However, while the general crowd gave him space, there was one man who couldn't take his eyes off him. This man was a wealthy, tech entrepreneur who had sold his company for billions a few years ago. He was young, maybe in his late 30s, with a suit that looked more expensive than everyone else's, and a watch that caught the light every time he moved. He was standing in the center of the room, surrounded by a group of people who were hanging on his every word. He had a loud, booming laugh that cut through the polite murmuring of the room. He was used to being the most important person in any room he entered. He loved attention. He craved it. He had built his entire personality on the idea that he was smarter, richer, and better than everyone else. As the evening went on, the tech mogul grew bored of the usual conversations about finance. He wanted some excitement. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning the faces until they landed on the quiet actor standing by the wall. A smirk spread across the millionaire's face. He saw Keanu not as a beloved icon, but as a challenge. He saw someone who was famous for being nice, and to him being nice was boring. He wanted to see if he could break that calm exterior. He wanted to make the night about himself. "Excuse me," the millionaire said to his group, his voice loud enough for people nearby to hear. "I think I need to go inspect the entertainment." He laughed at his own joke, and his group laughed with him, though a few of them looked uncomfortable. He grabbed a fresh glass of champagne from a passing waiter and began to walk across the room. The crowd seemed to part for him like the sea, but he wasn't interested in them. He had a target. Keanu was speaking softly to an older woman who ran the charity, nodding intently as she explained how the donations would be used. He was listening with his full attention, making her feel like she was the only person in the room. The kind interaction was interrupted by a shadow falling over them. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The jazz piano seemed to fade into the background as the heavy, confident footsteps of the millionaire approached. "Hey, everyone," the millionaire announced, not saying hello to anyone specific, but announcing his presence to the general area. He stepped right into Keanu's personal space, invading the quiet bubble the actor had created. He didn't look at the charity organizer. He looked directly at Keanu, his eyes gleaming with a mix of arrogance and mischief. He sized the actor up, looking at the simple suit and the calm face. "I knew it," the millionaire said, his voice carrying. "I told my friends you were hiding over here in the corner." He took a sip of his drink, waiting for Keanu to turn around and be impressed. Keanu turned slowly. He didn't look annoyed or angry. He just looked polite. He offered a small, tight smile. "Hello," Keanu said simply. His voice was low and calm. The room was watching now. The conversations nearby quieted down. People sensed that something was about to happen. The wealthy guests were experts at reading social cues, and they could sense the arrogance rolling off the tech mogul in waves. The charity organizer looked between the two men, sensing that the nice moment she was having with Keanu was over. She politely stepped back, but the millionaire stepped closer, blocking her escape and crowding Keanu. "You know," the millionaire said, gesturing around the room with his champagne glass, "I've always wondered about you Hollywood types. You all seem so mysterious." He paused, looking for a reaction. When Keanu just waited, listening, the millionaire frowned slightly. He wanted a bigger reaction. He wanted Keanu to feel small. "I mean, look at this place," the millionaire continued, raising his voice a little more. "We are here to change lives, to save kids. And here you are, just standing there," laughed again, a sharp, mocking sound. "I guess acting doesn't really require much effort, does it? Just memorize some lines, look tough, and cash the check." A few people in the nearby circle gasped quietly. It was rude even for this crowd where gossip was common. But the millionaire didn't care. He felt powerful. He felt like he was the main character of the night, and he had found the perfect person to push around to prove it. Keanu looked at him, his face remaining neutral, but his eyes grew a little sadder. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want to be the center of a scene. He just wanted to support the hospital. "It is important work they are doing here," Keanu said gently, nodding toward the charity banners. "That is why we are here." The millionaire waved his hand dismissively as if Keanu's words were annoying flies buzzing around his head. Yes, the charity. Great cause. But we are here to have a good time too, aren't we?" He leaned in closer, invading Keanu's space even more. He lowered his voice, but it was still loud enough for the front row of spectators to hear. "I've got $100,000 on the table right now, saying I can make your night a lot more interesting. What do you say, Keanu? You up for a little challenge?" The tension in the air was thick now. It wasn't just an awkward conversation anymore. It was a trap. The millionaire had set the stage, and he wasn't going to let the actor walk away without making a scene. He wasn't just being rude. He was hunting for a moment of humiliation, hoping to see the cool, collected movie star crack under pressure. The music played on, but for the small group gathered around them, the world seemed to stop spinning, waiting to see what would happen next. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. The challenge the millionaire had proposed wasn't a friendly game or a bet on a card game. It was a setup, and everyone in the immediate circle could feel it. The wealthy tech mogul didn't wait for Keanu to answer his question about whether he was up for some excitement. Instead, he took a step closer, invading the small bubble of personal space that most people respect without even thinking about it. He was so close that Keanu had to lean back slightly just to maintain eye contact without being physically touched. "You know," the millionaire began again, his voice dripping with a fake sort of admiration that was actually an insult. "I've watched your movies. They are great for simple entertainment." He let out a short, sharp laugh, looking around at his friends to make sure they heard him. "But I've always wondered, how much of you is actually in there? Or is it all just special effects and stuntmen?" The group of wealthy guests around them shifted uncomfortably. One man checked his watch, and a woman in a red gown took a sudden interest in her drink. They knew what was happening. This was a power play. The millionaire wasn't trying to have a conversation. He was trying to own the room. And in a room full of powerful people, the easiest way to climb to the top is to pull someone else down. Keanu, for his part, didn't take the bait. He stood perfectly still, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. He looked at the millionaire with a calm, steady gaze. It was the look of a man who had seen everything life had to offer, both the very best and the very worst, and didn't feel the need to prove himself to anyone. "I have been very lucky to work with talented people," Keanu replied quietly. His voice was soft, but it carried a warmth that the millionaire's voice lacked. "It is a collaborative art form." The millionaire scoffed so loudly it sounded like a bark. He hated that answer. He wanted Keanu to get angry. He wanted the actor to puff out his chest and brag about his box office numbers or his fame. Instead, Keanu was being humble, and for a man who valued only himself and his money, humility looked like weakness. Collaborative, the millionaire repeated, making the word sound like a joke. He swirled the champagne in his glass, the golden liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Sure, you run around, you jump off buildings, you point guns. It doesn't exactly require a degree in physics, does it? He took a sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving Keanu's face. I mean, let's be honest. You play characters who don't talk much. Is that a choice? Or is it just easier to memorize fewer lines? A few nervous giggles came from the crowd behind him, people who were laughing only because they were afraid not to. The atmosphere in the room had changed completely. The jazz piano in the background seemed to stop, or maybe everyone just stopped hearing it. The air felt heavy, charged with the kind of tension that makes your stomach hurt. People standing nearby, who weren't part of the immediate circle, had stopped talking to watch. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion. Nobody wanted to look, but nobody could look away. Keanu took a slow breath. He didn't look down at his feet, and he didn't look at the crowd. He kept his eyes on the man in front of him. There was a sadness in his expression now, a look that wondered why this stranger was trying so hard to be cruel. I think there is value in all kinds of storytelling, Keanu said gently. He wasn't arguing. He was stating a fact as simply as if he were commenting on the weather. Action, drama, comedy. They all allow us to feel something different. That is the magic of movies. The millionaire's smile faltered for just a second. He clenched his jaw, annoyed that his verbal jabs were bouncing harmlessly off the actor. He realized that words weren't going to be enough to break this man's cool. He needed to go further. He needed to make this public and embarrassing. He wanted to see the Hollywood star sweat feelings. The millionaire sneered, spitting the word out. You people in Hollywood are obsessed with feelings. But feelings don't build skyscrapers. Feelings don't code the operating systems that run the world. Feelings don't make you a billionaire. He gestured wildly around the room. I built an empire. I changed how the world works. What did you do? You pretended to be a guy on a bus. You pretended to be a kung fu master? He took another aggressive step forward. Now they were almost toe-to-toe. The contrast between the two men was striking. The millionaire was loud, his face red with the exertion of his own ego, his expensive suit looking a little tight around the middle. Keanu was still dressed in simple black, looking like a statue in a museum while a tourist yelled at him. My question is, the millionaire said, dropping his voice to a loud, harsh whisper, is there anything real inside that head of yours? Or are you just an empty suit, like the characters you play? The silence that followed was absolute. The charity organizer, standing a few feet away, looked like she wanted to step in. But she was frozen by the sheer audacity of the question. It was a humiliating thing to say to anyone, let alone a guest of honor at a charity event. To call someone empty, to imply they had no soul or intelligence, is the lowest form of insult. Keanu finally looked down. He looked at the floor for a brief moment, and the crowd gasped silently. They thought he was defeated. But when he looked back up, his eyes were clear. He wasn't defeated. He was just processing the cruelty of the stranger standing before him. I have many interests outside of acting, Keanu said. His voice was still quiet, but there was a new strength to it. Music, art, reading. I believe we should never stop learning. Music. The millionaire laughed, throwing his head back. This was the opening he had been waiting for. He seized the word like a weapon. You, music. He looked at his friends, his eyes wide with mockery. Let me guess. You play the drums? You bang on things? That fits your personality. Loud and repetitive. He was enjoying himself now. He felt the eyes of the room on him, and for the first time that night, he felt more famous than the movie star. He was the one commanding the attention. He was the one holding the power. The alcohol in his system was making him bold, stripping away the last bit of social filter he might have had. I actually play other instruments, Keanu said. He didn't say it defensively. He just said it. But it was a mistake to give the millionaire more information. The millionaire snapped his fingers. Of course. You're an artist? I forgot. He rolled his eyes so hard it looked painful. Well, I don't care about your hobbies. I care about talent. Real talent. He gestured dismissively toward the small stage where a 4-piece classical ensemble was setting up. They were tuning their instruments, a delicate process that requires quiet and focus. Those people, the millionaire pointed a shaky finger at the musicians, they have discipline. They have intelligence. They can do something you can never do. He turned back to Keanu, a cruel, triumphant smile plastered across his face. He thought he had finally found the way to humiliate him. He was going to prove that the dumb action star wasn't smart enough to understand real art. You wouldn't know a C-sharp from a hole in the ground, the millionaire sneered. The cruelty in his voice was palpable now. It wasn't just teasing anymore. It was a calculated attack. He wanted to strip away Keanu's dignity in front of hundreds of people. He wanted to show the world that money and power were superior to art and kindness. The room was dead silent. No one was drinking. No one was laughing. Even the musicians had stopped tuning their instruments to watch the confrontation. The tension was so tight you could feel it vibrating in your chest. Keanu stood there, taking it all in, absorbing the negativity like a sponge. He didn't fight back. He didn't insult the millionaire back. He just stood there, a pillar of calm in a storm of arrogance. The millionaire saw Keanu's silence as surrender. He thought he had one. He felt a rush of adrenaline, the kind that comes from dominating someone else. He decided to go for the kill shot. He was going to make Keanu do something to prove himself, something he was sure the actor couldn't do. He was going to turn this charity gala into his own private freak show, and he didn't care who he hurt in the process. He took a deep breath, ready to deliver the final blow, ready to make a demand that would leave everyone gasping. The wealthy man didn't wait for Keanu to answer his question about whether there was anything real inside his head. He simply turned his back on the actor, dismissing him as if he were a waiter who had just delivered the wrong drink. The arrogance radiating from the tech mogul was so thick that people standing 10 feet away could feel it. He marched away from Keanu, his eyes locked onto the small stage, where the classical quartet was quietly preparing for their set. The room fell into a nervous hush. The jazz pianist stopped playing, sensing that the mood had shifted from sophisticated to dangerous. Everyone watched the millionaire make his way toward the musicians. The 4 performers, a violinist, a cellist, and 2 others looked up in alarm as this powerful, obviously intoxicated stranger approached them. They were professional musicians, hired to provide background elegance. Not to be part of a rich man's game? You, the millionaire barked, pointing a finger directly at the first violinist. A young woman with a terrified expression. Give me that. He wasn't asking. He was demanding. He held out his hand, palm up, expecting her to place the instrument in it immediately. The musician looked at the event organizers for help, her hands tightening on the neck of her violin. She had worked her entire life to afford that instrument and to play at that level. The idea of letting a drunk, clumsy stranger touch it was horrifying. But the pressure in the room was immense. The organizers were frozen, afraid of causing a scene with one of the biggest donors of the night. Come on, I don't have all night, the millionaire snapped, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. I just want to look at it. It's for a good cause, remember? With trembling hands, the violinist slowly unscrewed the bow and hesitantly held out the instrument. The millionaire snatched it from her grasp. He didn't hold it with the respect of an artist. He held it like a toy he had just bought, grabbing the neck carelessly. The crowd winced. It was painful to watch a masterwork of craftsmanship being treated so roughly. He turned back to the room. Marching triumphantly toward Keanu, he held the violin high in the air, like a trophy he had just won. The spotlight from the chandelier caught the glossy wood of the instrument, making it gleam. He was enjoying every second of this. He felt like a gladiator entering the arena, ready to defeat his opponent. So, the millionaire shouted, drawing the attention of even the people in the back of the room. We were talking about talent. We were talking about whether there is any brain behind that pretty face. He stopped right in front of Keanu, closer than before. He thrust the violin toward the actor's chest. "Here is the deal," the man announced, his loud voice booming. "I bet you $5,000 cash right now that you can't play a single song on this thing." A ripple of shock went through the guests. $5,000 was nothing to this man, but the way he said it made the bet feel heavy and insulting. "And not just chopsticks," he laughed, looking around at his entourage for approval. "I mean a real song. Something that requires a soul." He looked back at Keanu, his eyes narrowing. "If you can play something beautiful, I will write the check to the hospital right now. But if you refuse, or if you sound like a dying cat, you have to admit that you're just a fake. An empty suit." The room was deadly silent. It was a humiliating setup. The millionaire was trying to force Keanu into a lose-lose situation. If Keanu refused, he would look like a coward or a snob who thought he was too good for the challenge. If he accepted and couldn't play, he would be publicly embarrassed in front of hundreds of the most influential people in New York. The man was gambling on the assumption that an action movie star had no real musical skill. People around the edges of the room started whispering. "This is wrong," one woman whispered to her husband. "Why is he doing this?" But no one stepped in to stop it. The power dynamic was too strong. Everyone was waiting to see how Keanu would react. Keanu stood still, looking at the violin. He didn't look at the millionaire's face. He looked at the instrument. His expression wasn't angry. If anything, he looked concerned for the violin itself, seeing that the millionaire was holding it incorrectly. He knew that this wasn't really about music or charity. This was about a man with too much money and not enough kindness trying to feed his own ego by tearing someone else down. "You're on," Keanu said quietly. The words were soft, but in the silence, they were heard clearly. The millionaire blinked, surprised that Keanu had actually accepted. A flash of excitement crossed his face. He thought he had one. He thought he had trapped the movie star. "Great, step right up." He shoved the violin and the bow into Keanu's hands. Keanu accepted them gently. As soon as the instrument left the millionaire's rough grip and entered Keanu's hands, the energy changed. Keanu held the violin with natural ease. He didn't hold it like a foreign object. He held it like an old friend. He placed the bow under his chin for a split second to check the tightness of the horsehair. A small, unconscious habit of someone who knows what they are doing. He adjusted the pegs at the top of the neck, listening intently to the plucking of the strings, tuning them by ear with a precision that made the professional violinists on stage raise their eyebrows. The millionaire laughed dismissively, missing the subtle signs of competence. "Oh, look at him. He knows which end is up." He clapped his hands loudly, mocking the actor. "Come on then, play us a masterpiece. Let's hear this soul you claim to have." He took a step back, crossing his arms, a smirk plastered on his face. He was ready to laugh. He was ready to mock. He was expecting a screeching noise, or for Keanu to fumble and give up. The anticipation in the room was agonizing. The guests held their breath, their hearts beating a little faster. They all liked Keanu. They didn't want to see him humiliated. But the trap had been sprung, and there was no way out now. Keanu didn't rush. He closed his eyes for a long moment, blocking out the lights, the staring crowd, and the smirking millionaire. He took a deep breath, letting the calmness wash over him. He wasn't thinking about the bet or the money. He was thinking about the music. He was remembering why he loved the violin, why he had spent hours practicing as a kid when he wasn't reading scripts or riding motorcycles. It was his escape. It was his peace. When he opened his eyes, the hesitation was gone. He stood up straighter, his posture transforming instantly. He wasn't the humble, quiet guy in the corner anymore. He was a musician. He lifted the violin to his shoulder and rested his chin on the chin wrist. His left hand found the neck of the instrument, his fingers curling around the strings with practiced muscle memory. The room became so quiet that you could hear the ice melting in the champagne glasses. The millionaire leaned forward, his mouth opening to deliver a sarcastic comment, but the words died in his throat. He saw the look in Keanu's eyes, the look of absolute focus and seriousness that he hadn't expected. For the first time that night, A small twinge of doubt flickered in the back of the rich man's mind. He watched, frozen, as Keanu raised the bow. The bow hovered over the strings for a fraction of a second. The crowd leaned in. The musicians on stage stopped breathing. Then Keanu brought the bow down. The bow made contact with the strings, and the sound that poured out was not the awkward screech everyone was expecting. It wasn't a simple choppy nursery rhyme either. Instead, a deep, resonant note filled the massive ballroom, vibrating in the chests of everyone standing there. It was a sound so pure and rich that it seemed to silence the noise of the city. Outside the thick walls, Keanu's eyes closed again the moment the music started. His left hand, which had been resting gently on the neck of the instrument, suddenly came alive. His fingers moved with a speed and precision that were breathtaking to watch. They danced across the fretboard, pressing down on the strings with practiced ease, shifting positions fluidly to change the notes. The melody he played was complex and haunting. It wasn't a happy, bouncing tune. It was something full of emotion, a piece that sounded like a story of heartbreak and hope woven together. The music swelled, rising and falling like ocean waves. It was a classical piece, heavy and serious, the kind of music that requires years of discipline to master. Every stroke of the bow was measured, every note clear and distinct. The effect on the room was instantaneous and absolute. It was as if someone had pressed a giant pause button on the world. Waiters froze in mid-step, holding trays high in the air. Guests, who had been whispering and gossiping, stopped with their mouths half open. The sound of ice clinking in glasses, the rustle of expensive dresses, the hum of the air conditioning, it all vanished. There was only the sound of the violin singing in the center of the room. The millionaire took an involuntary step backward. The smug, triumphant smirk that had been glued to his face just seconds ago began to crack. His eyes widened, darting from Keanu's calm face to the fingers flying across the strings. He had set a trap, expecting the actor to fail, expecting a clumsy performance that would give everyone a cheap laugh. But the reality was crushing him. He looked at the professional musicians on the nearby stage, expecting them to be rolling their eyes or laughing at the amateur. Instead, the violinist whose instrument Keanu was using was standing with her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. The cellist had stopped packing up his instrument and was staring, completely mesmerized. They were experts. They knew how hard this piece was. They could see the subtle vibrato in Keanu's hand, the way he controlled the tempo, the soul he was putting into every phrase. They weren't looking at an actor pretending to play. They were watching a master musician perform. The music grew faster, the notes becoming a flurry of rapid fire. Keanu's arm moved the bow with such power that it looked like it might snap, but he never lost control. He was lost in the music, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm. He wasn't performing for the crowd anymore. He wasn't trying to prove a point to the bully. He was just playing, connecting with something deep inside himself. The vulnerability of it was striking. He was pouring his heart out in a room full of strangers, using a language that needed no words. A hush fell over the crowd that went beyond just being quiet. It was a feeling of reverence. People who had come to show off their wealth and status suddenly felt very small. They were witnessing something real, something authentic, in a place that usually felt fake and plastic. The contrast was overwhelming. Here was a man the millionaire had called empty, filling the entire hall with a beauty that money couldn't buy. No amount of stock options or real estate deals could create a sound like that. The color began to drain from the millionaire's face. He looked around the room, desperate to find someone who shared his mockery, someone rolling their eyes. But he saw only awe. He saw heads tilted in appreciation, eyes glistening with sudden emotion. Even his own group of yes-men, the friends who usually laughed at his every joke, were staring at Keanu with open mouths. They had forgotten him completely. He was standing there, alone with his glass of champagne, shrinking by the second as the music grew louder and more powerful. The intensity of the piece reached its peak. Keanu's bow arm moved like lightning, the melody soaring to a high, trembling note that hung in the air, piercing and clear. It felt like the climax of a movie, the moment where the hero triumphs, not through violence, but through truth. The tension that had been building up all night, the cruelty of the insults, The discomfort of the guests, the arrogance of the wealthy, was released through that single, soaring note in that moment. The humiliation the millionaire had planned for Keanu boomeranged back with a force 1,000 times stronger. The humiliation was now entirely his own. He had tried to expose Keanu as a fraud, but instead he had exposed himself as small, cruel, and ignorant. He had tried to use art as a weapon, only to find that he was the one who got cut. The piece slowly began to wind down. The rapid notes smoothed out, becoming long, slow draws of the bow. The music softened, turning from a storm into a gentle rain. The audience felt like they could finally breathe again, though no one dared to make a sound. The final notes were played with such tenderness that it felt like a whisper in the ear. Keanu lifted the bow from the strings. Lowering his arm slowly to his side, he opened his eyes, the spell of the music breaking for him. But the room remained trapped in it. For what felt like an eternity, no one moved. No one clapped. No one spoke. The silence was deafening. The last echo of the violin note had faded into the high rafters of the ceiling. But the feeling of the music remained, wrapping around the guests like a heavy blanket. They were frozen, not by fear, but by the sheer impact of what they had just witnessed. It was one of those rare moments in life where the barrier between strangers dissolves, and everyone shares the exact same profound emotion. The millionaire stood rooted to the spot, his face pale and his mouth hanging slightly open. He looked at the man in the simple black suit, who was simply standing there, holding the violin with care, waiting for the room to come back to life. The arrogance had been completely stripped away, leaving him looking like a scolded child. He knew he had lost. He knew that no amount of money could buy the talent he had just seen, and certainly no amount of money could buy the respect that Keanu had earned in those 3 minutes of playing. The piano player in the corner didn't dare start up again. The waiters didn't move. The only movement was Keanu's hand, gently patting the side of the violin as if thanking it for the song. It was the most human moment in a room full of people trying too hard to be important. The freeze was total. The judgment passed not by a judge, but by the music itself. The silence in the grand ballroom couldn't last forever. It felt heavy, like a held breath that was begging to be released, but no one wanted to be the first to break the spell. It was the violinist from the stage who finally moved. She stepped forward, her eyes still wide with disbelief, and began to clap. It wasn't a slow, sarcastic clap. It was genuine, rhythmic, and filled with respect. That was the trigger. Suddenly, the room exploded. It wasn't just polite applause. It was a roar. The sound of hundreds of hands coming together was like thunder rolling through the hall. People who had been standing frozen in place rushed forward. The waiters, the wealthy investors, the celebrities. It didn't matter who they were or how much money they had. For that moment, they were all just fans of something beautiful. The sheer volume of the noise was overwhelming. It washed over the room, drowning out the jazz band, the clinking glasses, and the quiet whispers of the elite. The applause was so loud that the chandeliers seemed to shake. It was a wave of appreciation that the millionaire had never experienced in his life. Even though he had bought everything else he ever wanted, he couldn't buy this kind of love. Standing in the center of this chaos was the millionaire. The sound was hitting him like a physical blow. He looked around, dazed. His face, which had been red with arrogance just minutes ago, was now pale. He looked small. The friends who had been laughing at his jokes were now clapping enthusiastically, looking past him as if he wasn't even there. They were clapping for the man they had just mocked. The realization hit the millionaire hard. He wasn't the main character anymore. He was the villain, and everyone knew it. Keanu stood amidst the storm of applause, looking uncomfortable but grateful. He didn't raise his hands in victory. He didn't bow like a conquering hero. He just gave a small, modest nod to the crowd, a simple acknowledgement of their kindness. He looked like a man who wanted the noise to stop so he could go back to being invisible. The spotlight had found him. He didn't want to own it. He turned his attention away from the cheering guests and toward the young woman who owned the violin. He walked over to her, stepping through the crowd which parted for him instantly. He held the instrument out to her with both hands, presenting it carefully, as if it were a sacred object. He leaned in and said something to her that no one else could hear over the noise. She smiled, tearing up a little, and took the violin back. Keanu gently patted her on the shoulder, a gesture of solidarity between artists, before turning back to face the room. He had to walk past the millionaire to leave. The crowd quieted down slightly as they saw the two men come face to face again. The air crackled with tension. Everyone waited to see if Keanu would yell or make a sarcastic comment or demand an apology. The millionaire stood his ground, though he was shaking slightly. He clenched his jaw, trying to hold on to the last scraps of his dignity. Keanu stopped in front of him. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look triumphant. He looked calm. He looked at the millionaire with those sad, deep eyes that had seen so much of the world. "I think that counts as a song," Keanu said softly. His voice was quiet, but because the room had gone silent to listen. Everyone heard him. The millionaire opened his mouth, then closed it. He swallowed hard. He couldn't find his voice. He had lost the game he had started, and he had lost it badly. "So," Keanu continued, his tone completely neutral, "the $5,000 goes to the hospital, right?" The question hung in the air. It wasn't a question about the money. Everyone there knew $5,000 was nothing to these people. It was a question about honor. The millionaire had made a bet, and he had lost. The entire room was waiting to see if he was a man who kept his word, or just a loud mouth with a big bank account. The millionaire's face flushed a deep red. He felt the eyes of every single person in the room burning into him. He realized that if he tried to back out now, he would be finished. Not just for the night, but socially. He would be a pariah. He pulled a checkbook from his jacket pocket with trembling hands. He didn't have a pen. One of his friends stepped forward and silently handed him one. The millionaire scribbled on the check, ripping it out of the book with a sharp sound. He handed it to Keanu, his eyes refusing to meet the actor's gaze. He couldn't look at him. He was too ashamed. "Thank you," Keanu said simply. He took the check, folded it neatly, and placed it in the pocket of his own suit. "They will really appreciate this." There was no "I told you so." There was no mocking laugh. Keanu didn't rub it in. He accepted the victory with the same grace he had accepted the challenge. That kindness was worse than any insult. If Keanu had been mean, the millionaire could have gotten angry. But Keanu was nice, which made the millionaire feel even smaller. Keanu stood there for a moment longer, looking at the man who had tried to humiliate him. It felt like he was waiting for the millionaire to say something real, something human. But the millionaire just stared at the floor, crushed. "Have a good night," Keanu said. He turned and walked away. He didn't run. He didn't look back. He just walked toward the exit with his hands in his pockets, moving with a slow, steady pace. As he moved through the crowd, people reached out to touch his arm, to shake his hand, or just to say his name. The security guards opened the heavy doors for him, and he stepped out into the cool New York night. As soon as the doors closed behind him, the atmosphere in the ballroom changed drastically. The magic was gone. The tension remained, but now it was awkward and heavy. The jazz band started playing again, but it sounded hollow. The guests looked at each other, and they slowly began to look at the millionaire. He was still standing in the spot where Keanu had left him. He looked at the empty checkbook in his hand, then at the spot where the violinist was packing up her instrument. He looked around the room and saw the judgment on every face. No one was laughing. No one was impressed by his money anymore. He had tried to buy respect by tearing someone down, and he had ended up paying the price. People started to drift away from him. One by one, his group of friends dispersed, finding other people to talk to. Suddenly very interested in the charity auction or the dessert table. They didn't want to be associated with the man who had been shown up so badly. The party continued, but it felt different. The conversation wasn't about stocks or real estate anymore. Groups of people were gathered in corners, whispering excitedly about the performance they had just witnessed. They were talking about the surprise, the talent, and the incredible humility of the actor who had walked out the door without asking for anything in return. Outside, Keanu Reeves walked down the street. He hailed a taxi. He wasn't thinking about the millionaire. He wasn't thinking about the applause. He was just glad the money would go to the kids who needed it. He got into the back seat of the cab and disappeared into the traffic, leaving behind a room full of rich people who finally understood that sometimes the richest person in the room isn't the one with the most money, but the one with the most heart. The night ended, but the story of what happened would be told in that city for a long time. A lesson in why you should never judge a book by its cover or a movie star by his action movies.